Okay, we're going to read the book Some Answered Questions. It was written in 1908, or originally published then, and it's full of topics covered: prophets of God, human evolution, immortality of the soul. So I'll just slowly scroll through the contents here. So the first two parts are, this is about the manifestations of God, a little bit about fulfillment of prophecy. There you go, Christian subjects says there, bam, bam, bam. Powers and conditions of the manifestations of God, so describing the difference between manifestations and humans and what those manifestations are, and then a bunch of stuff about powers of humans and miscellaneous subjects. So this really covers a whole lot of Baha'i beliefs, not so much any laws or anything, but understandings and beliefs about the world and religion. So let's get started with part one. Nature's governed by one universal law. So part one, on the influence of the prophets in the evolution of humanity. Nature is governed by one universal law. Nature is that condition, that reality, which in appearance consists in life and death, or in other words, in the composition and decomposition of all things. Okay, so everything in the world has a cycle. It's either building up or decomposing, It's either progressing or regressing. Okay. This nature is subjected to an absolute organization, to determined laws, to a complete order and a finished design, from which it will never depart. To such a degree indeed, that if you look carefully and with keen sight, from the smallest visible atom to such large bodies of the world of existence as the globe of the sun or the other great stars and luminous spheres, whether you regard their arrangement, their composition, their form, or their movement, you will find that all are in the highest degree of organization and are under one law from which they will never depart. So, intelligent design, I guess that's talking about. Yeah, so whether it's the smallest thing or the largest things that we can perceive in existence, there's intelligent design behind them. But when you look at nature itself, you'll see that it has no intelligence, no will. For instance, the nature of fire is to burn. It burns without will or intelligence. The nature of water is fluidity. It flows without will or intelligence. The nature of the sun is radiance. It shines without will or intelligence. The nature of vapor is to ascend. It ascends without will or intelligence. Thus, it is clear that the natural movements of all things are compelled. There are no voluntary movements except those of animals, and above all those of man. Man is able to resist and to oppose nature, because he discovers the constitution of things, and through this he commands the forces of nature. All the inventions he has made are due to his discovery of the constitution of things. For example, he invented the telegraph, which is the means of communication between the East and the West. It is evident, then, that man rules over nature. Okay, so that's sort of my understanding of what science is, right? The manipulation of this physical world. We look into things, we understand how they work, and then we can manipulate them. Now, When you behold in existence such organizations, arrangements, and laws, can you say that all these are the effect of nature? Though nature has neither intelligence nor perception. If not, it becomes evident that this nature, which has neither perception nor intelligence, is in the grasp of Almighty God, who is the ruler of the world of nature. Whatsoever he wishes, he causes nature to manifest. One of the things which has appeared in the world of existence, and which is one of the requirements of nature, is human life. Considered from this point of view, man is the branch, nature is the root. Then, can the will and the intelligence, and the perfections which exist in the branch, be absent in the root? It is said that nature, in its own essence, is in the grasp of the power of God, who is the eternal Almighty One. He holds nature within accurate regulations and laws and rules over it. The reader will there see that the Bahá'í Faith has not an anthropomorphic conception of God, and that if it employs a customary terminology, it is careful to explain its symbolic meaning. So, I've got the dictionary up so that we can look at words like anthropomorphic and give them proper meaning. So, relating to characterized by anthropomorphism, that doesn't help much, does it? Having human characteristics. There you go. So, we're not saying that God is designed looking like a human. In other places in the writings it talks about the virtue of God, and that those virtues are the things which we as humans are created in his image with. So there we go. Nature's governed by one universal law. Let's go on to the next chapter. Chapter 2, Proofs and Evidence of the Existence of God. Proofs and Evidences of the Existence of God. One of the proofs and demonstrations of the existence of God is the fact that man did not create himself. Nay, his creator and designer is another than himself. It is certain and indisputable that the creator of man is not like man, because a powerless creature cannot create another being. The maker, the creator, has to possess all perfections in order that he may create. Can the creation be perfect and the creator imperfect? Can a picture be a masterpiece and the painter imperfect in his art? For it is his art and his creation. Moreover, the picture cannot be like a painter, otherwise the painting would have created itself. However perfect the picture may be, in comparison with the painter, it is in the utmost degree of imperfection. Yeah, okay, so paintings can't create themselves and they have a creator. Okay. The contingent world is the source of imperfections. God is the origin of perfections. The imperfections of the contingent world are in themselves a proof of the perfections of God. For example, when you look at a man, you see that he is weak. This very weakness of the creature is a proof of the power of the eternal Almighty One, because if there were no power, weakness could not be imagined. Then the weakness of the creature is a proof of the power of God. For if there were no power, there could be no weakness. So from this weakness it becomes evident that there is power in the world. Again, in the contingent world there is poverty. Then necessarily wealth exists. Since poverty is apparent in the world, in the contingent world there is ignorance. necessarily knowledge exists, because ignorance is found. For if there were no knowledge, neither would there be ignorance. Ignorance is the non-existence of knowledge, and if there were no existence, non-existence could not be realized. Okay, so it's sort of saying there's the perfections of the universe don't exist, right? There is no, we can't be perfect, but we can strive for perfection. But God, the fact that the imperfection exists proves that the perfection of God exists, because there is a standard to measure it against, which seems to be an infinite standard of whatever. You know, talks here about strength in man, so a certain amount of strength or health, you can always have more, because we are not perfect. But how do we know there's more? Because perfection exists in the Creator. Okay. It's certain that the whole contingent world is subject to a law and rule which it can never disobey. Even man is forced to submit to death, to sleep, and to other conditions. That is to say, man in certain particulars is governed, and necessarily this state of being, governed, implies the existence of a governor. Because a characteristic of contingent beings is dependency, and this dependency is an essential necessity. Therefore, there must be an independent being whose independence is essential. In the same way, it is understood from the man who is sick that there must be one who is in health, for if there were no health, his sickness could not be proved. Therefore, it becomes evident that there is an eternal Almighty One, who is the possessor of all perfections, because unless he possessed all perfections, he would be like his creation. Throughout the world of existence, it is the same. The smallest created thing proves that there is a creator. For instance, this piece of bread proves that it has a maker. Praise be to God. The least change produced in the form of the smallest thing proves the existence of a creator. Then can this great universe, which is endless, be self-created and come into existence from the action of matter and the elements? How self-evidently wrong is such a supposition? Yeah, so it can't just come into being out of nothingness with no cause, right? So the creator is the cause. These obvious arguments are adduced for weak souls, but if the inner perception be open, 100,000 clear proofs become visible. Thus, when man feels the indwelling spirit, he is in no need of arguments for its existence. But for those who are deprived of the bounty of the spirit, it is necessary to establish external arguments. Okay, so the first couple of chapters of this book are, I guess, laying the framework to then follow on with all of the other things in the content. But so saying, you know, this is adduced for weak souls, but if you're a weak soul, you need to start somewhere, and so we're going to build upon each. Let's go back to the contents and move on to part 3. The need of an educator. When we consider existence, we see that the mineral, vegetable, animal, and human worlds are all in need of an educator. If the earth is not cultivated, it becomes a jungle where useless weeds grow. But if a cultivator comes and tills the ground, it produces crops which nourish living creatures. It is evident, therefore, that the soil needs cultivation of the farmer. Consider the trees. If they remain without a cultivator, they will be fruitless, and without fruit they are useless. But if they receive the care of a gardener, these same barren trees become fruitful. And through cultivation, fertilization, and engrafting, The trees which had bitter fruits yield sweet fruits. These are rational proofs. In this age, the people of the world need the arguments of reason. So, talking about farming. You could argue that fruits still grow in the wild or something like that, but obviously only in small amounts here and there. Yet, when we cultivate the earth, we can give it a much greater yield for the continuation of our species and others, I guess. Okay. The same is true with respect to animals. Notice that when the animal is trained, it becomes domestic. And also that man, if he's left without education, becomes bestial. And moreover, if left under the rule of nature, becomes lower than an animal. Whereas, if he is educated, he becomes an angel. For the greater number of animals do not devour their own kind, but men, in the Sudan, in the central regions of Africa, kill and eat each other. Yeah, so this was written in 1908, I think it was. 1908 was the first publication. And cannibalism was definitely a thing. Probably still goes on there. Africa still has some tribal warfare going on, and watch YouTube, there's a lot of stuff going on over in Africa. Now reflect that it is education that brings the East and the West under the authority of man. It is education that produces wonderful industries. It is education that spreads great sciences and arts. It is education that makes manifest new discoveries and institutions. If there were no educator, there would be no such thing as comforts, civilization, or humanity. If a man be left alone in the wilderness, where he sees none of his own kind, he will undoubtedly become a mere brute. It is then clear that an educator is needed. Sure, I mean, anyone who's spent any time with kids knows that they need to be guided and educated, or morally, or else they become little animals. So absolutely. But education is of three kinds: material, human, and spiritual. Material education is concerned with progress and development of the body through gaining its sustenance, its material comfort and ease. This education is common to animals and man. Yeah, so animals learn what to eat and how to eat, and look at some build nests and dig burrows and find ways to live where they're not going to get attacked while they're sleeping, and they probably do that near a food source. So common to animals and man. Human education signifies civilization and progress. That is to say, government, administration, charitable works, trades, arts and handicrafts, sciences, great inventions and discoveries, and elaborate institutions, which are the activities essential to man as distinguished from the animal. Yeah, things that civilize, civilization, things to make our communities work. Divine education is that of God. It consists in acquiring divine perfections, and this is true education. For in this state, man becomes the focus of divine blessings. The manifestation of the words. Let us make man in our image, and after our likeness. This is the goal of the world of humanity. Now, we need an educator who will be at the same time a material, human, and spiritual educator, and whose authority will be effective in all conditions. So if anyone should say, I possess perfect comprehension and intelligence, and I have no need of such an educator, he would be denying that which is clear and evident, as though a child should say, I have no need of education, I will act according to my reason and intelligence, and so I shall attain the perfections of existence. Or as though the blind should say, I am in no need of sight, because many other blind people exist without difficulty. Yeah, so that's a challenging one. I like to think I possess perfect comprehension and intelligence, but we all know that no one does. Yeah, and you know, it talks about the child here teaching itself, which is, you know, crazily you see some people saying that they want to let their children just learn for themselves and they don't want to teach them anything, and we don't have to tell them the names of colors or what a tree is, or they'll just work it all out for themselves and let's see what they're meant to learn. That's craziness, right? We need education. Then it is plain and evident that man needs an educator, and this educator must be unquestionably and indubitably perfect in all respects and distinguished from all men. Let's see what that word indubitably means. Come on. Damn. Okay. Google doesn't even know. Indubitably. With 5 syllables is the kind of mouthful. Is kind of a mouthful. What? Here's how to say it. Indubitably. Yep. And while it's more of an old-fashioned adverb, it remains a unique way to say undoubtedly. Okay. So indubitably means undoubtedly. And the fact that it was Google at first didn't even know what it meant was a good reason to look for that word. So then it's plain and evident that man needs an educator, and this educator must be unquestionably and indubitably perfect in all respects and distinguished above all men. Otherwise, if he should be like the rest of humanity, he could not be their educator, more particularly because he must be at the same time their material and human as well as their spiritual educator. That is to say, he must teach men to organize and carry out physical matters, and from a social order, in order to establish cooperation and mutual aid in living, so that material affairs may be organized and regulated for any circumstances that may occur. In the same way, he must establish human education. That is to say, he must educate intelligence and thought in such a way that they may attain complete development, so that knowledge and science may increase, and the reality of things, the mysteries of beings, and the properties of existence may be discovered. That day by day, instructions, inventions, and institutions may be improved, and from the things perceptible to the senses, conclusions as to intellectual things may be deduced. Okay, so mankind needs an educator that is unquestionably and indubitably perfect, undoubtedly. So that we can have a tangible example of those things that we looked at in the previous chapter that talked about the perfections, right? We need a tangible way to sense those perfections and a standard to hold ourselves to, so we can improve in all these other things. You must also impart spiritual education so that intelligence and comprehension may penetrate the metaphysical world and may receive benefit from the sanctifying breeze of the Holy Spirit, and may enter into relationship with the Supreme Concourse. He must so educate the human reality that it may become the center of the divine appearance, to such a degree that the attributes and the names of God shall be resplendent in the mirror of the reality of man, and the holy verse, "We will make the man in our image and likeness," shall be realized. It is clear that human power is not able to fill such great office, and that reason alone could not undertake the responsibility of so great a mission. How can one solitary person, without help and without support, lay the foundations of such a noble construction? He must depend on the help of the spiritual and divine power to be able to undertake this mission. One holy soul gives life to the world of humanity, changes the aspect of the terrestrial globe, causes intelligence to progress, vivifies souls, lays the basis of a new life, establishes new foundations, organizes the world, brings nations and religions under the shadow of one standard, delivers man from the world of imperfections and vices, and inspires him with the desire and need of natural and acquired perfections. Certainly nothing short of a divine power could accomplish so great a work. We ought to consider this with justice, for this is the office of justice. Yeah, okay, so interestingly, since Baha'u'llah's come and revealed the revelation of God, the world has gone through amazingly drastic changes since the Bab came in 1844, and then Baha'u'lláh declared his mission in 1863, and you know, the material world that we know has changed massively since that time. And also, you know, the spiritual world is these teachings of permeating mankind, whether they know where they're coming from or not, slowly permeating mankind. Racism is a good example of that, where, you know, in the 1800s, people didn't recognize other races as human. You know, there was this people, there were different races, but now we understand that mankind's one. Not every country, people are still racist on an individual level, yet it's permeating the conscious minds of humankind that that's the truth. Anyway, I'll continue. A cause which all the governments and people of the world, with all their powers and armies, cannot promulgate and spread. One holy soul can promote without help or support. Can this be done by human power? No. In the name of God. For example, Christ alone and solitary upraised the standards of peace and righteousness, a work which all the victorious governments with all their hosts are unable to accomplish. Consider what was the fate of so many and diverse empires and peoples. The Roman Empire, France, Germany, Russia, England, etc. All were gathered together under the same tent. That is to say, the appearance of Christ brought about a union among these diverse nations, some of whom, under the influence of Christianity, became so united that they sacrificed their lives and property for one another. After the time of Constantine, who was the protagonist of Christianity, divisions broke out among them. The point is this, that Christ united these nations, but after a while, governments became the cause of discord. What I mean is that Christ sustained a cause that all the kings of the earth could not establish. He united the various religions and modified ancient customs. Consider what great differences existed between Romans, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Israelites, and other people of Europe. Christ removed these differences and became the cause of love between these communities. Although after some time, governments destroyed this union, the work of Christ was accomplished. So, Constantine, who was the protagonist of Christianity. Constantine the Great, 272. So he unified Rome under the cross. The leading character or one of the major characters in a play, film, or novel. An advocate or champion of a particular cause or idea. So Constantine was that leading champion of Christianity, right? And then after him, divisions broke out. So everything started dividing. Therefore, the universal educator must be at the same time a physical human and spiritual educator, and he must possess a supernatural power, so that he may hold the position of a divine teacher. If he does not show forth such a holy power, he will not be able to educate. For if he be imperfect, how can he give a perfect education? If he be ignorant, how can he make others wise? If he be unjust, how can he make others just? If he be earthly, how can he make others heavenly? This is the reason why we need the perfect divine educator, the perfections of the divine educator. Now we must consider justly, did these divine manifestations who have appeared possess all these qualifications or not? If they had not these qualifications and these perfections, they were not real educators. Therefore, it must be our task to prove to the thoughtful, by reasonable arguments, the prophethood of Moses, of Christ, and of the other divine manifestations. And the proofs and evidences which we give are not based on traditional, but on rational arguments. It's now been proved by rational arguments that the world of existence is in the utmost need of an educator, and that its education must be achieved by divine power. There's no doubt that this holy power is revelation, and that the world must be educated through this power, which is above human power. So, this book is going to go on to talk about Moses and Christ and other prophets of God, manifestations of God, and go on to, it's saying there's no doubt that we need these divine teachers who have this these heavenly perfections to teach us. So we'll continue on to part number 4. Okay, part 4, Abraham. One of those who possessed this power and was assisted by it was Abraham, and the proof of it was that he was born in Mesopotamia, and of a family who were ignorant of the oneness of God. He opposed his own nation and people, and even his own family, by rejecting all their gods. Alone and without help, he resisted a powerful tribe, a task which is neither simple nor easy. It is as if, in this day, someone were to go to the Christian people who are attached to the Bible and deny Christ. Or in the papal court, God forbid, if such a one were in the most powerful manner to blaspheme against Christ and oppose the people. Yeah, so Abraham opposed everyone around him because they believed in idol gods, many gods, and he said there's only one God. And it's not saying that he's a blasphemer when it goes on here. It's giving the example of how hard it would have been. So, if you were to go into the heart of Christianity and blaspheme against Christ in the papal courts, you know, you'd be crucified, metaphorically, you know. Yeah. So these people believed not in one God but in many gods, to whom they ascribed miracles. Therefore they all arose against him, and no one supported him except Lot, his brother's son, and one or two other people of no importance. At last, reduced to the utmost distress by the opposition of his enemies, he was obliged to leave his native land. In reality, they banished him, in order that he might be crushed and destroyed, and that no trace of him might be left. Yeah, so, you know, no one supported him. Abraham was against everyone there, and they kicked him out. They told him to get away from them. Yeah. Abraham then came into the region of the Holy Land, so into Israel, which wasn't Israel at the time, but the story goes that God told Abraham that his seed shall inherit the earth. It may say that in a second, hang on. His enemies considered that his exile would lead to his destruction and ruin, as it seemed impossible that a man banished from his native land, deprived of his rights and oppressed on all sides, even though he were a king, could escape extermination. But Abraham stood fast and showed forth extraordinary firmness, and God made this exile to be to his eternal honor, until he established the unity of God in the midst of the polytheistic generation. This exile became the cause of the progress of the descendants of Abraham, and the Holy Land was given to them. As a result, the teachings of Abraham were spread abroad. A Jacob appeared among his posterity. Let's look at the word posterity. The descendants of Abraham. Okay, so among his descendants, a Jacob appeared, and a Joseph, who became ruler in Egypt. In consequence of his exile, a Moses and a being like Christ were manifested from his posterity. And Hagar was found, from whom Ishmael was born. One of those descendants was Muhammad. In consequence of his exile, the Bab appeared from his posterity. And the prophets of Israel were numbered among the descendants of Abraham. So all of the prophets who have come are descended from Abraham. And so it will continue forever and ever. Finally, in consequence of his exile, the whole of Europe and most of Asia came under the protecting shadow of the God of Israel. See what a power it is that enabled a man who was a fugitive from his country to found such a family, to establish such a faith, and to promulgate such teachings. Can anyone say that all this occurred accidentally? We must be just. Was this man an educator or not? It's a loaded question, I guess, because the answer is he was. And obviously, that story has to have a designer behind it, right? Since the exile of Abraham from Ur to Aleppo in Syria produced this result, we must consider what will be the effect of the exile of Bahá'u'lláh in his several removes from Tehran to Baghdad, from thence to Constantinople, to Rumelia, and to the Holy Land, Haifa, Israel, Akka. See what a perfect educator Abraham was. Yeah. So that's a little bit about the story of Abraham and showing how his education, he educated humanity. Let's go to part 5. Moses. Moses was for a long time a shepherd in the wilderness. Regarded outwardly, he was a man brought up in a tyrannical household, and was known among men as one who had committed a murder and become a shepherd. By the government and the people of Pharaoh, he was much hated and detested. It was such a man as this that freed a great nation from the chains of captivity, made them contented, brought them out of Egypt, and led them to the Holy Land. This people, from the depths of degradation, were lifted up to the height of glory. They were captive, they became free. They were the most ignorant of people, they became the most wise. As the result of the institutions that Moses gave them, they attained a position which entitled them to honor among all nations, and their fame spread to all lands, to such a degree indeed, that among surrounding nations, if one wished to praise a man, one said, "Surely he is an Israelite." Moses established laws and ordinances. These gave life to the people of Israel, and led them to the highest possible degree of civilization at that period. To such a development did they attain that the philosophers of Greece would come and acquire knowledge from the learned men of Israel. Such a one was Socrates, who visited Syria, and took from the children of Israel the teachings of the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. After his return to Greece, he promulgated these teachings. Later, the people of Greece rose in opposition to him, accused him of impiety, arraigned him before the Areopagus, and condemned him to death by poison. I imagine that's some sort of court. Let's have a look. Rock outcropping located. Its English name is yeah, right. In classic times it functioned as the court. Alright, so in classical times it functioned as the court for trying deliberate homicide. So yeah, it's a court. Back to where we were. And condemned him to death by poison. Now, how could a man who was a stammerer, who had been brought up in the house of Pharaoh, who was known among men as a murderer, who through fear had for a long time remained in concealment, and who had become a shepherd, establish so great a cause, when the wisest philosophers on earth have not displayed 1,000th part of this influence? This is indeed a prodigy. A man who had a stammering tongue, who could not even converse correctly, succeeded in sustaining this great cause. If he had not been assisted by divine power, he would never have been able to carry out this great work. Well, that's reassuring, seeing I'm reading this out on the internet. A man had a stammering tongue. I'm sure that I mispronounced some words and stuff, so have mercy on me. These facts are undeniable. Materialist philosophers, Greek thinkers, the great men of Rome, became famous in the world, each one of them having specialized in one branch of learning only. Thus Galen and Hippocrates became celebrated in medicine, Aristotle in logic and reason, and Plato in ethics and theology. How is it that a shepherd could acquire all of this knowledge? It is beyond doubt that he must have been assisted by an omnipotent power. Consider also what trials and difficulties arise for people. To prevent an act of cruelty, Moses struck down an Egyptian and afterward became known among men as a murderer. More notably, because the man he had killed was of the ruling nation, he then fled, and it was after that he was raised to the rank of a prophet. In spite of his evil repute, how wonderfully he was guided by supernatural power in establishing his great institutions and laws. Yeah, so a short story of Moses, again sort of putting the magnifying glass on. Clearly there's a divine hand behind all of this. That's the purpose of this, to show proofs and evidences that these divine educators are divinely guided. Good. Let's go to part 6. Christ. Afterward Christ came, saying, I am born of the Holy Spirit. Though it is now easy for the Christians to believe this assertion, at that time it was very difficult. According to the text of the Gospel, the Pharisees said, Is not this the son of Joseph of Nazareth, whom we know? How can he say, therefore, I came down from heaven? Yeah, so when Christ first came, although there's a lot of Christians in the earth today, no one wanted to believe in him at first. And they're saying, is Joseph's his dad? How can he come from heaven? We know his dad. Briefly, this man, who apparently and in the eyes of all was lowly, arose with such great power that he abolished a religion that had lasted 1500 years. At a time when the slightest deviation from it exposed the offender to danger or death. Yeah, so that's Judaism, obviously. So he came and abolished Judaism. Moreover, in the days of Christ, the morals of the whole world and the condition of the Israelites had become completely confused and corrupted, and Israel had fallen into a state of the utmost degradation, misery, and bondage. At one time, they had been taken captive by the Chaldeans and Persians. Could be Chaldeans. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. At another time, they were reduced to slavery, and the Assyrians. Then they became the subjects and vassals of the Greeks, and finally, they were ruled over and despised by the Romans. This young man Christ, by the help of a supernatural power, abrogated the ancient Mosaic law, reformed the general morals, and once again laid the foundation of eternal glory for the Israelites. Moreover, he brought to humanity the glad tidings of universal peace, and spread abroad teachings which were not for Israel alone, but were for the general happiness of the whole human race. Those who first strove to do away with him were the Israelites, his own kindred. To all outward appearances, they overcame him and brought him into direst distress. Last, they crowned him with the crown of thorns and crucified him. But Christ, while apparently in the deepest misery and affliction, proclaimed, This sun will be resplendent, this light will shine. My grace will surround the world, and all my enemies will be brought low. And as he said, so it was. For all the kings of the earth have not been able to withstand him. Nay, all their standards have been overthrown, while the banner of that oppressed one has been raised to its zenith. Yes, so even though outwardly they killed him and crucified him and thought they'd, destroyed the cause of Jesus, it's spread around the world and kings can't stop it. There's a divine hand at play there. But this is opposed to all the rules of human reason. Then it became clear and evident that this glorious being was a true educator of the world of humanity, and that he was helped and confirmed by divine power. Yeah, so some proofs of Christ being a divine educator. Alright, let's go on to the next paragraph. the next chapter. Part 7, Muhammad. So, talk about Muhammad, which, as Baha'is, we believe Muhammad was a manifestation of God, which is a stumbling block for a lot of Christians because they can't see how. Maybe reading through this will give you an insight. There's a big difference between Muhammad and the teachings of Sharia law, and just like there's a big difference between Christ and some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, especially through the Dark Ages, where they were making people convert by the sword. Anyway, let's read through Muhammad. Now we come to Muhammad. Americans and Europeans have heard a number of stories about the Prophet, which they have thought to be true, although the narrators were either ignorant or antagonistic. Most of them were clergy. Others were ignorant Muslims who repeated unfounded traditions about Muhammad, which they ignorantly believed to be to his praise. Yes, so a lot of the traditions and things that get spoken of in modern day Islam are not true. There's a difference between the true story of Muhammad and what's commonly referred to in a lot of the surahs and the writings in modern Islam. Thus, some benighted Muslims made his polygamy the pivot of their praises and held it to be a wonder, regarding it as a miracle, and European historians, for the most part, rely on the tales of these ignorant people. For example, a foolish man said to a clergyman that the true proof of greatness is bravery and the shedding of blood, and that in one day, on the field of battle, a follower of Muhammad had cut off the heads of 100 men. This misled the clergyman to infer that killing is considered the way to prove one's faith to Muhammad, while this is merely imaginary. The military expeditions of Muhammad, on the contrary, were always defensive actions. A proof of this is that during 13 years in Mecca, he and his followers endured the most violent persecutions. At this period, they were the target of the arrows of hatred. Some of his companions were killed and their property confiscated. Others fled to foreign lands. Muhammad himself, after the most extreme persecutions by the Qurayshites, let's look at that in a second, who finally resolved to kill him, fled to Medina in the middle of the night. Yet even then, his enemies did not cease their persecutions, but pursued him to Medina, and his disciples even to Abyssinia. So let's look what the Qurayshites are. There's no page on Qurayshites. However, okay, perform pilgrimage, Maybe I have to Google it. Quraysh. Gain their name. Okay, so it's not Qurayshites, but the Quraysh. Okay, so they were in Mecca. Yeah, okay, tribe of people. Let's continue. These Arab tribes were in the lowest depths of savagery and barbarism, and in comparison with them, the savages of Africa and wild Indians of America were as advanced as Plato. The savages of America do not bury their children alive as these Arabs did their daughters, glorying in it as being an honourable thing to do. Thus, many of the men would threaten their wives, saying, "If a daughter is born to you, I will kill you." Even down to the present time, the Arabs dread having daughters. Okay, so this might trigger a lot of people, but he's not being racist here. just factual that tribes lack education, this spiritual education. It's not saying that Africans or Indians are inherently more savaged or barbarous. It's just saying that at the time there were tribes in Africa that, that we spoke about before, with cannibalism, and the American Indians had tribal warfare, and there was savage nations. It's not saying that they inherently don't have the same capacities as all other humans. It's about spiritual education. So, and even today, Arabs dread having daughters. Yeah, okay. So this is where they were at. They were like really tribal, savage people when Muhammad was there. Further, a man was permitted to take 1,000 women, and most husbands had more than 10 wives in their household. When these tribes made war, the one which was victorious would take the women and children of the vanquished tribe captive and treat them as slaves. So this is the world that Muhammad came into, the such barbarity in Arabia, that people were taking 1,000 wives. This is pre-Islam. So, a warlord, it's like Genghis Khan just owned everything, right? These are like there's mini Genghis Khans running around. When a man who had 10 wives died, the sons of these women rushed at each other's mothers. And if one of the sons threw his mantle over the head of his father's wife and cried out, "This woman is my lawful property," at once the unfortunate woman became his prisoner or slave. He could do whatever he wished with her. He could kill her, imprison her in a well, or beat, curse, and torture her until death released her. According to the Arab habits and customs, he was her master. Wow. Wow, poor women in that area. It is evident that malignity, jealousy, hatred, and enmity must have existed between the wives and children of a household, and it is therefore needless to enlarge upon the subject. Again, consider what was the condition in life of these oppressed women. Moreover, the means by which these Arab tribes lived consisted in pillage and robbery, so that they were perpetually engaged in fighting and war, killing one another, plundering and devastating each other's property, and capturing women and children whom they would sell to strangers. How often it happened that the daughters and sons of a prince, who spent their day in comfort and luxury, found themselves when night fell reduced to shame, poverty, and captivity. Yesterday they were princes, today they are captives. Yesterday they were great ladies, today they are slaves. Muhammad received the divine revelation among these tribes, and after enduring 13 years of persecution from them, he fled. But this people did not cease to oppress. They united to exterminate him and all his followers. It was under such circumstances that Muhammad was forced to take up arms. This is the truth. We are not bigoted and do not wish to defend him, but we are just, and we say what is just. Look at it with justice. If Christ himself had been placed in such circumstances, among such tyrannical and barbarous tribes, and if for 13 years he with his disciples had endured all the trials with patience, culminating in flight from his native land, if in spite of this, these lawless tribes continued to pursue him, to slaughter the men, to pillage their property, and to capture their women and children, what would have been Christ's conduct with regard to them? If this oppression had fallen only upon himself, he would have forgiven them, and such an act of forgiveness would have been most praiseworthy. But if he had seen that these cruel and bloodthirsty murderers wished to kill, to pillage, and to injure all these oppressed ones, and to take captive the women and children, it is certain that he would have protected them, and would have resisted the tyrants. What objection, then, can be taken to Muhammad's actions? Is it this, that he did not, with his followers and their women and children, submit to these savage tribes. To free these tribes from their bloodthirstiness was the greatest kindness, and to coerce and restrain them was a true mercy. They were like a man holding in his hand a cup of poison, which when about to drink, a friend breaks and thus saves him. If Christ had been placed in similar circumstances, it's certain that with a conquering power, he would have delivered the men, women, and children from the claws of these bloodthirsty wolves. Yeah, so seeing as I'm talking to the Western audience, and majority who don't believe Muhammad was a prophet of God, I think one of the really hard things for people to view what goes on here is we look at history through the lens of today. So we think that people are going to be acting like we act as modern day humans, where mankind's one. We believe that we're all we believe regardless of color of our skin or where we're born, that we're all humans, and we have compassion and mercy towards other humans. But put in the circumstance of, Muhammad's in a place where these people cut the heads off women, bury them alive. It's full on just tribal warfare, and the people who were after them were just murderous, thieving psychopaths. So, like it said here, if it was just him, yeah, okay, lie down and sacrifice, be the bigger man. But he's protecting his people. So, and he's not protecting them from loving, kind, people who are coming over to give him a cup of tea. He's protecting them from psychopathic, barbarous murderers. So, this is another way to look at that whole story, which is quite hard for people in the West to grasp. Muhammad never fought against the Christians. On the contrary, he treated them kindly and gave them perfect freedom. A community of Christian people lived at Najran and were under his care and protection. Muhammad said, "If anyone infringes on their rights, I myself will be his enemy, and in the presence of God I will bring a charge against him." In the edicts which he promulgated, it is clearly stated that the lives, properties, and honor of the Christians and Jews are under the protection of God, and that if a Mohammedan married a Christian woman, the husband must not prevent her from going to church, nor oblige her to veil herself, and that if she did, he must place her remains in the care of the Christian clergy. Should the Christians desire to build a church, Islam ought to help them. In case of war between Islam and her enemies, the Christians should be exempt from the obligation of fighting, unless they desired of their own free will to do so in defense of Islam, because they were under its protection. But as a compensation for this immunity, they should pay a yearly small sum of money. In short, there are 7 detailed edicts on this subject, some copies of which are still extant at Jerusalem. This is an established fact and is not dependent on my affirmation. The edict of the second caliph still exists in the custody of the Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, and of this there is no doubt. The edict of the second caliph, huh? Give it a quick wiki. Probably won't come up. Maybe a Google. The Pact of Umar, attributed to the second caliph. That could be it. Nevertheless, after a certain time, and through the transgression of both the Mohammedans and the Christians, hatred and enmity arose between them. Beyond this fact, all the narrations of the Muslims, Christians, and others are simply fabrications, which have their origin in fanaticism or ignorance, or emanate from the intense hostility. So it's saying that there's a lot of lies and fabrications in modern understandings of what's going on in Islam, or what went on in Islam. For example, the Muslims say that Muhammad cleft the moon and that it fell on the mountain of Mecca. They think that the moon is a small body which Muhammad divided into two parts and threw one part on this mountain and the other part on another mountain. Not sure if it's about to go into it, but if you read the Kitab-i-Khan, you'll come to understand what the moon means in religious scripture, and it represents the religions of God. So maybe when it says Muhammad cleft the moon, it says he's cutting it in two. And there's another thing that we get told where Muhammad said that the sun sets in a muddy pond. It's talking about the religion going down into, sort of becoming a dirt, like setting into a dirt. It's metaphorical. Anyway, it may go on to talk about the moon here in a second. Such stories are pure fanaticism. Also, the traditions which the clergy quote and the incidents with which they find fault are all exaggerated, if not entirely without foundation. Briefly, Muhammad appeared in the desert of Hijaz, in the Arabian Peninsula, which was a desolate, sterile wilderness, sandy and uninhabitable. Some parts, like Mecca and Medina, are extremely hot. The people are nomads, with the manners and customs of the dwellers in the desert, and are entirely destitute of education and science. Muhammad himself was illiterate, and the Quran was originally written upon the blade bones of sheep or on palm leaves. These details indicate the condition of the people to whom Muhammad was sent. The first question which he put to them was, why do you not accept the Pentateuch and the Gospel? And why do you not believe in Christ and Moses? This saying presented difficulties to them, and they argued, our forefathers did not believe in the Pentateuch and the Gospel. Tell us, why was this? He answered, they were misled. You ought to reject those who do not believe in the Pentateuch and the Gospel, even though they are your fathers and your ancestors. In such a country, and amid such barbarous tribes, an illiterate man produced a book, in which, in a perfect and eloquent style, he explained the divine attributes and perfections, the prophethood of the messengers of God, the divine laws, and some scientific facts. Thus, you know that before the observations of modern times, that is to say, during the first centuries and down to the 15th century of the Christian era, all the mathematicians of the world agreed that the earth was the center of the universe and that the sun moved. The famous astronomer, who was the protagonist of the new theory, discovered the movement of the earth and the immobility of the sun. Until his time, all the astronomers and philosophers of the world followed the Ptolemaic system, and whoever said anything against it was considered ignorant. Though Pythagoras and Plato, during the later part of his life, adopted the theory that the annual movement of the sun around the zodiac does not proceed from the sun, but rather from the movement of the earth around the sun, this theory had been entirely forgotten, and the Ptolemaic theory was accepted by all mathematicians. But there are some verses revealed in the Quran contrary to the theory of the Ptolemaic system. One of them is, the sun moves in a fixed place, which shows the fixity of the sun. and its movement around an axis. Again, in another verse, and each star moves in its own heaven. Thus is explained the movement of the sun, of the moon, of the earth, and of other bodies. When the Quran appeared, all the mathematicians ridiculed these statements and attributed the theory to ignorance. Even the doctors of Islam, when they saw that these verses were contrary to the accepted Ptolemaic system, were obliged to explain them away. It was not until after the 15th century of the Christian era, nearly 900 years after Muhammad, that a famous astronomer made new observations and important discoveries by the aid of the telescope, which he had invented. The rotation of the Earth, the fixity of the sun, and also its movements around an axis were discovered. It became evident that these verses of the Quran agreed with existing facts, and that the Ptolemaic system was imaginary. In short, many Oriental peoples have been reared for 13 centuries under the shadow of the religion of Muhammad. During the Middle Ages, while Europe was in the lowest depths of barbarism, the Arab peoples were superior to the other nations of the earth in learning, in the arts, mathematics, civilization, government, and other sciences. The enlightener and educator of these Arab tribes, and the founder of the civilization and perfections of humanity among these different races, was an illiterate man, Muhammad. Was this illustrious man a thorough educator or not? A just judgment is necessary. So again, coming from the West, a lot of people have difficulties believing that Muhammad is a manifestation of God, because we're judging Islam by its modern fruits, which are basically like what Christianity went through with the Dark Ages after Muhammad came. And then people, the Dark Ages were barbarous and the Catholic Church slaughtered a lot of people. That's sort of what Islam's doing at the moment. It's in the name of Muhammad, but it's not what Muhammad wanted at all. So yeah, more research into who Muhammad was if you want, but he was a divine educator. Yet there's more to the story, because progressive revelation says that now the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh are here. I believe the Bab is in the next chapter, so let's go there. Chapter 8, the Bab. As for the Bab, may my soul be his sacrifice. At a youthful age, that is to say, when he had reached the 25th year of his blessed life, he stood forth to proclaim his cause. It was universally admitted by the Shiite that he had never studied in any school and had not acquired knowledge from any teacher. All the people of Shiraz bear witness to this. Nevertheless, he suddenly appeared before the people, endowed with the most complete erudition. Let's have a look at what that means. I believe it means education, but we'll see. Quality of having or showing great knowledge or learning and scholarship. He suddenly appeared before the people, endowed with the most complete erudition. Although he was but a merchant, he confounded all the ulama of Persia, all alone, in a way which is beyond imagination. He upheld the cause among the Persians, who are renowned for their religious fanaticism. This illustrious soul arose with such power that he shook the supports of the religion, of the morals, the conditions, the habits and the customs of Persia, and instituted new rules, new laws, and a new religion. Though the great personages of the state, nearly all the clergy, and the public men arose to destroy and annihilate him, he alone withstood them and moved the whole of Persia. Many ulama and public men, as well as other people, joyfully sacrificed their lives in his cause and hastened to the plane of martyrdom. The government, the nation, the doctors of divinity, and the great personages desired to extinguish his light, but they could not do so. At last his moon arose, his star shone forth, his foundations became firmly established, and his dawning place became brilliant. He imparted divine education to an unenlightened multitude, and produced marvelous results on the thoughts, morals, customs, and conditions of the Persians. He announced the glad tidings of the manifestation of the Son of Baha to his followers and prepared them to believe. The appearance of such wonderful signs and great results, the effects produced upon the minds of the people and upon the prevailing ideas, the establishment of the foundations of progress, and the organization of the principles of success and prosperity by a young merchant, constitute the greatest proof that he was a perfect educator. A just person will never hesitate to believe this. So for those who aren't fully aware of the story of the Bab, he proclaimed his message in 1844 in the middle of modern day Iran, really, so in Persia, to be the gate. So the Bab means the gate. He's the gateway to Bahá'u'lláh, who is the glory of God. So as John the Baptist is to Jesus, the Bab is to Bahá'u'lláh. He came first and prepared the people for the coming of the manifestation, the promised one. So the Bab is the Mehdi to Islam, and there was basically a huge revolution in Iran at the time, and a lot of people knew of the Bab and his claims, and I think like half the country turned to him. And then if you read the Dawnbreakers, which I've never read the whole book, but I've read an abridged version. It's a very thick, large book. Don't have a copy of it here. It's on this website, I'm sure. It's the history of the Bahá'í Faith, of the Bahá'í Faith, anyway. So that's a little bit about the Bab. Came in the darkest part of Islam. So let's move on to Baha'u'lláh.